keynote talks. What we want to do now is give you some thoughts from people on the ground, people who are involved in conservation efforts, environmental issues, and also some people from NGOs and from the private sector. A rapid succession of several people, key players here in Indonesia, to talk to you and perhaps give some response to the challenges we just heard from Secretary Cohen and from Dr. Sudit. So first I'd like to call on Dr. Steve Monfort. He is a wildlife veterinarian and scientist, the director of the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute based in the U.S. state of Virginia. Come on up, sir. He leads a team that conducts research in 25 countries. He's an expert on the conservation of amphibians, tigers, and antelopes, among other animals. Dr. Steve Monfort.
Very much. I want to thank the organizers and the sponsors for giving me an opportunity today to represent the Smithsonian. I want to elaborate and perhaps explore, following up on some of the inspirational comments that we've just heard. And the theme that I'm going to explore is what is the common ground, or can we reach common ground between development and biodiversity conservation? And so you've already heard the world's population is 7 billion people and growing fast. We're now a globalized society. We're connected by our economies, by internet technologies, and an unrelenting need for natural resources. We also face common environmental challenges: pollution, invasive species, habitat fragmentation, overexploitation of resources, and climate change, all that threaten economic prosperity and the well-being of all citizens. But the loss of biodiversity, which is a special case, can most be traced to factors such as inadequate land use planning, poor natural resource management schemes, the lack of good governance structures, insufficient human capacity. In other words, humans are really almost always the prime agents of biodiversity loss. As a conservation biologist, I've come to understand that simply longing for an idyllic past that no longer exists will not help me or any of us to solve the most pressing environmental problems of our time. Likewise, I've come to understand that corporations and governments that fail to adopt environmental sustainability as core business practice will threaten their own productivity and profitability, while also running the risk of alienating their customers and citizens who consume the products that they produce and or regulate. And interestingly, as we become more focused on the very real threats posed by climate change, we become distracted from the responsibility to make truly meaningful progress in our own lifespans. Now, Indonesia, as has been said already a number of times, is home to some of the most magnificent biodiversity on Earth. But these biodiversity resources provide major economic benefits to society. And it's been estimated that, in a general sense, biodiversity can account for maybe somewhere between 2 and 15% of gross domestic product for any individual country. But when you look at the same biodiversity resources in more basic terms, things like timber, fisheries, and food, for example, these can easily account for 45 to 90% of household incomes for rural communities. So in other words, when we're judging public versus private profits, the loss of ecosystem services, sometimes referred to as natural capital, are most often and first affected and felt by the poorest sectors of society. In a recent report entitled The Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity for National and International Policymakers, the authors attribute the rapid loss of forests, soils, wetlands, and corals to what they refer to as essentially virtual economic invisibility. So put another way, the report states that we are running down our national capital without understanding the value of what we are losing. It is widely recognized that investments in what we term ecological infrastructure provide many benefits, including climate regulation, soil formation, erosion control has been referred to, and natural risk management, as well as improved livelihoods for local people and benefits of poverty alleviation. So like many countries, though, the ecosystem infrastructure as well as the human capacity and conservation within Indonesia needs to be supported. And there is a clear need for increased technical and professional capacity in the conservation and biodiversity sciences, but also there must be a lot of attention paid to focusing on building capacity in protected area management, wildlife law enforcement, and in developing good governance practices. Likewise, there should be more expertise in the economics of biodiversity valuation, a continued development of innovative financing mechanisms, and improved infrastructure planning strategies that account for the true ecological and economic cost of development. And these will all be essential to reaching that equilibrium that I'm referring to between development and conservation. Probably the most important thing that we need to remember is that we can't forget the critical importance of developing and creating community incentives for conservation. In fact, the solutions for environmental problems must begin at the outset with the inclusion of the public and local communities, because after all, biodiversity is fundamentally a public commodity. Now, it's encouraging to see that corporations in Indonesia and elsewhere are voluntarily subjecting themselves to new sustainability certification programs, so that they're exploiting these innovative financing mechanisms like RED and RED Plus, for example, and adopting self-regulating practices in terms of corporate and social responsibility schemes. But the truth is, these schemes typically lack or have weak or no explicit requirement to sustain biodiversity within them. And I would say, shouldn't we place greater value on forests as carbon sinks when they also harbor life's rich diversity? And do we really believe that social responsibility can be achieved in the absence of biodiversity conservation? I mean, in short, biodiversity conservation should not be considered sort of an optional add-on to our portfolio of doing social good, but rather it must be explicitly recognized that sustaining ecosystem functions provide essential economic, social, and cultural benefits to society. So in fact, given the massive natural capital of Indonesia and the importance of these resources in supporting the livelihood of people, it was suggested to me yesterday by a colleague that, why don't we consider the concept of corporate, social, and environmental responsibility? It's assumed that environmental responsibility is a component of CSR, but in fact, it's not an explicit component. By doing something of this nature, we could show people that these values are overlapping and inseparable in terms of their importance. At the very least, biodiversity conservation should be incorporated into sustainability goals that are part of corporate efforts to create their mission statements, for example. Environmental problems are complex. They're not going to be simple, as has been pointed out already many times, and requires partnerships across all sectors of society and an engaged citizenry. So we're talking about governments, corporations, NGOs, and communities. In the Indonesia context, though, we should remember that many of the endangered species that we're talking about exist outside of protected areas. For example, roughly 70% of orangutans and 80% of elephants exist outside of protected areas. So therefore, wildlife management and species conservation has already become a critical component and responsibility for private sector stakeholders. But even as private sector stakeholders develop well-managed, well-designed programs for managing species on private lands, oftentimes they lack the capacity and the knowledge to implement these programs effectively on their own. Fortunately, Indonesia has a rich diversity of NGOs and experts that they can draw upon that are willing and able to assist in implementing these programs, wherever they may exist. Of course, governments, as has been alluded to already, have a critical role in regulation and mandate wildlife protection, and they also must be prepared to pursue legal remedies in terms of enforcing compliance with both corporations and citizens, because these efforts are after all, going to be designed to protect the nation's natural capital. So it is true, as has already been said, that this conference represents an important opportunity to begin exploring the benefits of cross-sector engagement in species and habitat conservation for sustainable development. So I strongly encourage you all to seize upon the momentum that may come from this workshop and figure out how effective partnerships can be designed and implemented to underpin the process of integrating conservation into development practice. So what I want to say is success in solving what seem to be intractable environmental problems are not going to be achieved by just pitting one sector against another, or by dwelling on past failures. And as Emma Maris writes in her new book, Rambunctious Garden, I quote, layering goals and managing landscapes with an eye to the future rather than to the past is the cutting edge of conservation. So in the end, success requires strong leadership and collaboration to ensure that natural capital, those are the things responsible for life on Earth, is accounted for in whatever calculations are made about financial and physical capital, those things that constitute gross domestic product, for example, so that we can achieve an appropriate balanced impact in terms of human and social capital, those things that account for the quality of life and well-being of our citizens. What we need now, though, are corporations and sectors to exert leadership at this critical time to demonstrate that these kinds of principles can be actually implemented in real terms. So the goal of society's needs in terms of meeting needs for fuel, food, medicine, fiber, these things do not have to be incompatible with creating sustainable long-term ability of the Earth to provide resources that we need to survive. Now, like all citizens of the Earth, I believe that Indonesian citizens have a very, very strong connection with nature. And this connection is evident through the country's culture, its history, and its diversity. And this emotional connection that we all have with nature, and in particular the beauty and the sustenance that we derive from it, in my view, is the common ground that brings us together as people and as organizations. Many of us, in fact, believe that nature is something that we hold sacred, and it's something that provides order for our world, and it gives us meaning about the purpose of life and our role in that life. So I contend that if we're going to solve problems, emotions alone are not going to be sufficient. But if we place emotional and economic values on nature, we stand to make better decisions because, after all, we protect what we value most. I'll quote the economist Pavan Sukhdev, who says, the question is, how are we touching wild nature? As planetary locusts or as planetary stewards? And if we are behaving as locusts, might that be due to an error in our evaluation of natural capital? So, we're faced with the reality that humans now will and forever be responsible for shaping and managing landscapes involved with the organisms, including humans, that we require for survival. We already possess much of the fundamental knowledge that we need to make good decisions in support of nature, but we're at a crossroads. And we need to ask ourselves if we're going to be the generation that's remembered for causing the extinction or for regenerating species like the tiger and the rhino, the Asian elephant, the orangutan, and many of the other magnificent species of Indonesia. So as a conservationist and a scientist, I by definition am an optimist, and I'm optimistic about the potential that human beings have to solve problems of their own making. But as a realist, I'm absolutely sure that effective solutions to the extinction crisis that are ongoing now require strong vision and leadership from the very highest levels of the public and industrial sectors. These are the sectors that have the greatest potential to both exhaust nature, but also to conserve it and to achieve sustainable gains that benefit all citizens. So as human populations grow, there's going to be no letdown in development. That's a fact. So mainstreaming conservation into development practices are best and perhaps our last hope for reaching this equilibrium that I was referring to between development, biodiversity, and conservation. I've already had an opportunity to meet with some of you yesterday. I was very inspired by the work that you're doing, by your optimism, and also your realism about what needs to be done. I look forward to learning more about what you're doing, what your ideas are, and understanding how we can tap that energy and knowledge and enthusiasm to create effective strategies and sound public policies that have two things, that are both economically efficient and socially responsible. Thank you very much.